Hey guys, before we get into the episode, I just wanted to take a second to talk to you about 12 Strides and 12 Group Norms for Liberty and Recovery. This is a book by former guest of the show, Asher Azo. And what it is a deep dive into libertarianism and 12-step philosophy. Not only do you get to learn about how to apply those principles to your very own life, but you also get to see what it looked like for the recovery community going through lockdowns and the COVID hysteria. Also included at the end of the book is a fictional story about a man in recovery searching for his own son. You can find this book on Amazon, paperback, or it's also available on Kindle. I will include the link to the book in the show notes page for this episode, so please go check it out. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Clean Libertarian Podcast. And I have a great episode lined out for you guys today. This is a very close friend of mine from the Rooms of Recovery. This is Mr. Ben D. And I've known Ben for quite a few years and have been able to, been fortunate enough to go to events and hang out and get to know the man. And he's got one hell of a story. And one of the things I really like about Ben is that we both enjoy kind of working through some of the philosophical aspects of recovery. And kind of the way that he approaches things gets me thinking about some of those areas of recovery that I don't normally necessarily think about. And I appreciate that. I enjoy that. You know, a phrase you've heard me say many, many times, and you'll hear me say it many times more, is that iron sharpens iron. And so these kinds of relationships that I have in my personal life, I value so very much. And I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation we had, because I know that I did. So without any further ado, here is Mr. Ben. All right, Brother Ben, how are you doing, sir?
I'm good. I'm enjoying summertime. We got some
Yes.
traveling going on. Just got back from Glacier National Park. Beautiful,
Woo!
nice. It was like 60 degrees, and then we landed in Dallas, and it was 103. So,
Reality check, real quick,
yes,
huh?
100%.
Totally, dude. I went out to Reno not too long ago, and
Nice.
everywhere I went in this hotel, was a convention, and so there's multiple floors, and I would have to walk up the stairs, and like just being at that higher elevated, location, like, dude, I could not breathe, man. It's
Yeah,
very strange how different locations do that to you.
yeah. I
But
was worried about it because I was asthmatic as a kid, and my first time in the Rockies was tough on me, but I didn't have any issues.
well, that's good, man. So like, did that, you said you're asthmatic as a kid. Is that something that just like went away? Like, what is that?
Um, there's a couple of components. One is that juvenile asthma can kind of clear up on its own just as you get older and the lungs kind of strengthen. Um, there's also another funny coincidence, which is I started smoking cigarettes when I was about 9, and I quit in my early 20s. And wouldn't you know, my lungs got better.
Huh.
Um,
Who'd have thunk
Imagine
it?
that,
Yeah.
right? So,
Right on, man. Well, Ben, you have been and continue to be a very important part of my own life and recovery family. And this is always a pleasure anytime I can get somebody that I hold in such high regard to come on and kind of share who they are and you know what made our paths cross, more or less. You know what I mean? What makes you you? And so just initially, I'm gonna throw the ball in your court, man, and tell us about who you are.
sure. So I was you heard a little bit of this, but I was born and raised in Texas, in College Station, which is named after the fact that it had a college and a train station. Just to give you an idea of what the town was
Nice,
like.
nice.
And I grew up. I'm close with my family. They're a very healthy family, which I know isn't always common amongst the addiction recovery community. Um, but I always think it's also important to not treat addiction as if it is just a consequence of childhood trauma, or for me that's not how it played out. Um, I grew up in a Baha'i household, which is it's a major world religion, but it's not really well known, um, as, as being a little bit more recent in history. And while I don't prescribe to it, I do think it had a pretty positive impact on me growing up. And for anybody who is religious, I do think it's worth taking a look at, even if just from a scholarly perspective, or to know about this other group of people out there. That for me, um, I can't help but, and not to offend those who are religious, but for me, often when somebody says they're religious, my brain jumps to them being self-righteous, right? And kind of, um, I mean, I grew up, I still live in the Bible Belt, so there's that kind of, you can feel that kind of judgment and condemnation, and that
Mm.
wasn't my personal experience in my household. And part of the relevance is, it also meant that I had a drug-free household. No recreational drug use of any kind. Um, my parents and my sisters don't drink or engage in any other drug use, and so that's kind of how I started off. And one of the moments I remember my thinking and my perspective shifting actually came from a DARE lesson. So DARE being drug abuse resistance education, which is also like the dumbest
Yes.
acronym ever, right?
Yes.
I I love a good acronym just as much as the other person, and I just feel like they were like, oh look, we made a word. It's the
Yeah.
worst word you can use for that. But my memory is we're learning about different categories of drugs and their the consequences, the symptoms and side effects. And there's just this like table where you can look at groups and then just go across and look at these different descriptions. And I was reading about them, and I came across the word euphoria. I'm in fifth
Ooh.
grade, so I raised my hand and I'm like, what is euphoria? And the officer who was teaching the class that day, and that we gave quite a hard time to, uh, told me to just look it up in the dictionary. So I go to the dictionary and I look up euphoria, and I was like, that sounds pretty great.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Sounds
that's
amazing.
right. That's a and and so that's at that point, it became interest in me. Um, I didn't have connections yet in fifth grade, but it became a curiosity. And while I know, now looking back, I know that there are a lot of factors that played into me continuing to use drugs, and that kind of fuel my relationship with them. I do think that a lot of it for me just started out purely as curiosity, right? I mean, so here
Mm.
was this thing that for my logical brain at that time, it didn't feel that risky or dangerous. Um, because when especially kind of picking and choosing what drug I was initially interested in, um, it didn't seem that dangerous. And I don't blame my 12-year-old self. Um, Looking back, it it doesn't, right? Because for
Yeah.
me, the experience of addiction, a lot of it is illogical, right? So I could not understand, you know, choosing drugs where there's not a high chance of overdosing. It felt like if you were careful and showed your activities, that wasn't much of a danger. and so then the negative consequence that was less left on the list was addiction. And so you try to explain that to someone who hasn't experienced it, and it doesn't make sense. Like it never made sense to me how my willpower couldn't be enough. That
Mm,
that if it was causing problems in my life, that I wouldn't just stop.
right.
Um, so I felt okay venturing forward, and then we know how that story plays out. So um, occasional use turned into daily use, and exploring one drug led into exploring another, and the next thing I know, years down the road, I got to be like, oh, this is what they meant. You know, this is uh, getting that to experience this, like having a moment where I believe the I wanted nothing more than to stop using, and then within 5 minutes being like, no, that wasn't real, right? What I
Yeah.
really want is the next hit. You know, to want two opposite things so strongly at the same time. I couldn't
Mm,
have imagined that before I experienced it. And you know, the other way I've thought about it is, um, you hear this like, oh, I could stop whenever I want to, right? And
yeah.
I still think there's truth to that. The problem is, an addict can't want to. You know,
Ooh, that's a
it was
good
like
point, man.
I
Yeah.
was just shifting the blame.
Yeah.
Um, no matter what was going on in my life, on a deep level, I still wanted to keep using, and so that took me. Um, I got through public school. I had some issues with truancy, but grade wise, I was fine. I could skate by, and I had a sense, um, that I wouldn't make it 4 years in high school, so I actually took the initiative to take the self-paced kind of joke classes by, um, whenever I could, and I got out of high school in 3 years, which then, um, coming off of a crazy night, when I didn't know what I was going to do next, I decided I did want to give college a try. So I landed myself in college, pretty well versed in the drug world, um, but also really young. Like, so I was 17, living on a college campus away from my home, um, and like the go-to expert. Right? So
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so needless to say, that didn't work out real well, and
Right.
it started this kind of uh, pendulous swing in, of course, always identifying the wrong problem, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
I thought a lot of my issue, it was always, there was kind of an outside focus, right? So it was problems with the educational system. Well, I don't need a degree. And I'm just going to go back to, I managed restaurants. I have 13 years of burrito rolling experience. I can roll a really good burrito. Just so you know, if that's ever you ever need somebody.
Dude, I'm
Um,
keeping that in the back burner for sure. Like that will come into
100%.
play.
So um, there were some in Oklahoma for a little while, but I think the last one closed down during the pandemic. Freebird's World Burrito. I started working there when I was 15 years old, and yeah, I can roll a big old burrito. But
Nice.
so I would work that job, and I was moderately happy. Um, but there was kind of a, like, is this a, how long could this keep me happy? And
Mm,
my drug habit was such that I could hold down a job, and I could kind of ride that line where, um, I was making enough money to meet my desires, but just barely, right? So uh, so living a very uh, impoverished lifestyle, even though I was making enough money not to be impoverished, because so much of it was tied up in my drug use. But I was able to hold down a job and I was able to more or less make ends meet, but I wasn't happy. And I would then turn around and say, it's because I need a, a, a career, but all the other ones that I have my eyes on are require an education. So I'm going to go back and get an education. And then I would flunk out and I'd go back to the restaurant. And then I'd spend some time at the restaurant and then I'd go back to college. I go back and forth and I did it, I think, 3 times. And one of the things that I found out is that if you flunk college um, at a public university, you get put on academic probation. And if you fail to improve your grade, um, you can be academically suspended. So one little wake up call for me was I got suspended from public universities in the state of Texas.
Ooh.
Um, and I was like, oh well. So now now the next time the pendulum swings and I decide I want to go to college, that's not going to be an option here for a little bit. So that was going on, but um, more more significant was the internal deterioration. Um, I, you know, you do know, right? Which is one of the things that can make it difficult to, again, to try to explain it to a 12-year-old or anybody who hasn't experienced it. There's always going to be this gap in understanding
Mm.
where when I'm talking to someone like you, I know there's a bridge across that gap, right?
Right.
But I, my brain was shooting off in every direction and grasping at straws and torturing itself. I have lots of memories of kind of going to sleep at night, um, you know, coming down before passing out, and actually having this wave of optimism of, of I'm going to get a good night's sleep, and I'm going to start tomorrow. It's going to be a new day. I'm going to do things differently, and I'm putting my plans together as I'm falling asleep. But then, right before I fall asleep, I would think to myself, "I've done this before,"
Mm.
and then I
That's
woke
the
up, and I'm
worst, man.
oh my God,
Oh.
because there was this insanity of how many times have I done this? And just really being like, for a moment I believed it. And then I was staring head on at I have had this experience hundreds and hundreds of times. This has been going on for months, probably even years at this point. And and that was unsettling. Um, I also started to get very kind of I don't I was at a loss for how to relate to society, including my family. And I think one thing for me with drug addiction was when I was kind of trying to balance the scales, it felt like all I was really risking was self harm. Um, and then as I got a little bit older, I did realize that I was letting people down and harming them and uh, having unrealistic expectations of them. And so where my brain went was, um, well, the only reason uh, I'm harming people in my life with my choices is because there are people in my life, right? So,
Mm.
so if I just get rid of all of the people, then it goes back to being self harm, right? And
Yeah.
it's almost humorous to look back on it now, but I legitimately was the first thing I did uh, clean was attend a school for wilderness emergency medicine training as a prerequisite to go to wilderness survival schools because my plan was to find a nice little patch of wilderness and just walk out into it and see how long I could make it.
Dude, I identify. Yes.
that
Yes.
was the plan, and I half I had the fortune, I guess, of kind of bringing in my family on my plan, um, and and there was a gap between what I had been doing and when the school started. So they recommended that I go visit my sisters. At this point in time, my family was spread out, right? My parents were living internationally. My closest sister was like 3 hours away. So I went and I visited her. And then I hopped on a train and I went up to Michigan to visit my oldest sister,
Mm-hmm.
who had gotten married about 2 months earlier. And her new husband had 14 years clean. And I come back to find out later on that while these family discussions are going on, and he's new to the family, so he's not on the phone, but he's in the background, like over my sister's shoulder, like, get him up here, get him in the armor. And
Yeah.
so he got me to a 12-step meeting, and I was interested, but then I turned around and I did my wilderness and emergency medicine training. Happened to stay clean during that, but came back to Michigan and really dug in to the 12-step program and got involved. Um, I often joke that I showed up to Michigan for a visit with 3 suitcases, and that visit lasted me about 8 years.
Nice.
So, and that's where I started putting in the work and learning more about a practical solution. I find it fun to kind of philosophize about the nature of addiction, which is, you know, mental, physical, spiritual, and social, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
societal component, which is where I think you and I have some shared interests. And but before I could really play with any of those, I had to get a practical solution in my life, and so I relied on the wisdom and guidance of people who had done similar, and I applied myself, and changes started occurring, and I was able to get back into college. Um, Originally, I had this the wilderness emergency medicine. I was like, oh, medicine is kind of interesting, so I started out in that trajectory. Um, but then I was like, oh, humans are interesting, but so are squid. And so I kind of broadened my focus and studied biology with a cellular molecular focus. And But I worked in ecology, so I was pretty well rounded. And I was working on a master's degree when my wife finished her bachelor's, and I was kind of floundering. Academia has some challenges that I'm not well suited to. The whole publish or perish aspect of academia was doesn't suit me very well. I'm not super ambitious. Never been a very disciplined student. So when she finished, we she went on a job hunt, and it brought us back to the South. Uh, so we moved. She got a new job, and we were pregnant with our first child. So I was like, "Oh, I need a job like
Yeah.
now." And
No.
I what I had been looking at was the publisher pair side of the collegiate science system and doing research. Um, wasn't something I was well suited to. I did like the lecturing side, and that's where I thought I was as headed to work as a lecturer at like a community college level. But I wasn't done with my master's, and here we had moved, so um, I was able to be alternatively certified to teach on the high school level, which essentially means I'm in a setting where you need to know as much or more about how to teach as you do about the subject. On the college level, they don't really care that much about how well you can teach. You just need to be an authority in your subject.
Mm.
So I got to learn by being in the deep end, splashing around, and I've picked up quite a bit along the way. And I mean, I come from an education family, and my wife is a much more skilled educator than I am. But it's so interesting to me um, that it's where I landed and that I found a passion for it, and I have no intention of leaving the high school classroom anytime soon because that is I would have never guessed when I was in high school that that's where I was going to end up, right? Because I didn't want to be there, right? I was working to graduate early, and even with that, I still had truancy charges brought against me because I didn't want to be there. And so it's been interesting now being back in that environment and seeing the perspective kind of shift. Your I feel like attitudes towards authority, right? A lot of those of us in the recovery community,
Yeah.
always a healthy relationship with authority. Um, but those have to shift really quick when all of a sudden you are the authority, right? So
Ooh,
being a
yeah.
parent and being a teacher, all of a sudden it's a little different, and it kind of forces, or at least for me, it forced some empathy on me of, oh, this is not an easy thing to do. And yeah, so that's kind of where how I got to today, and then being in this local area and involved in recovery, our paths crossed, and haven't got to spend as much time with you as I would like, but mostly just because the last several times it's just like guaranteed good conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we will rectify that soon without any shadow
Oh,
of a doubt. Um,
absolutely.
but you have so I mean, obviously, we come from different schools of thought on certain topics. But one of the things that I like about you is you have that desire that I do. I could, that you just want to know the information. You just want to find out where is the other person coming from. And I'm very interested in stuff like that myself. And I wonder if more people did that in regards to recovery, in regards to understanding more about how addiction affects us as a society and as a group of people striving for a better way to live, if we wouldn't be a little bit better off, you know
I mean, I
um,
think absolutely we would. I think the challenge is that uh, it is by its nature uncomfortable until
mm,
you've practiced with it. And so, and it's not to say that I can't again be uncomfortable, um, but I wish more people would kind of push through and kind of get the experience. Um, but I do understand the seeking out like-mindedness, um, uh, but it's definitely problematic, right? I've
yeah.
been really interested these last couple of years in how do you go about identifying your own biases, right?
Mm,
Because they're often they are blind spots, and I will say that science, while not perfect, is does try to train a different attitude towards. We still call it argumentation, but normally when you talk about arguing, it's like right, wrong, winner type of thing. And you shared something similar to this a couple of broadcasts back with the steel sharpening steel. Um, in the sciences, there's a sense of you argue your ideas in part to better understand your ideas, right? Just to
mm,
make a stronger argument. Um, and I'm not going to pretend that scientists are these spiritual beings. They don't all have it down, but there's at least that goal. And
right.
there's been scientific conferences where people got into fist fights over the classifications of fish. There's this famous incident, but so so they're definitely not perfect at it. But yeah, and then living, trying to focus on principles, that open mindedness is has been key for me. Um, but yeah, it's some of that closing off happens at a very uh, unconscious and like gut level. You know, um,
Yeah.
I was recently looking at this stuff about um, brainwashing, which isn't really a real thing, But it kind of led to this field of study and kind of um, when sacred beliefs are kind of attacked or brought up, it changes where information is moving in the brain, right? So when our very core principles um, are a topic, we actually are less likely to send information to the prefrontal cortex where we're having logical reasoning, and we're going to have more movement into the amygdala, like emotional centers.
Mm.
And the uh, psychology and neuroscience is all very difficult because there's a whole lot of variables going on. But it's an interesting story and one that rings true to me, which is this sense of the counter to that is still feeling accepted, right? So it's having either the people offer it to you or having enough like self assurance that even if this conversation goes awry, it doesn't mean that we. I'm not rejecting you as a human, right? I'm just saying
Mm.
I think differently than you on this topic, and as long as we can kind of express that acceptance, that kind of undercuts the some of the emotional defensive reaction we have to our ideas being challenged. So,
Yeah, man.
which is um, the whole idea to me. So, studying biology, I teach zoology, so biology, but specifically animals. And one of the things that I've appreciated about that over time is, um, to better understand my nature and how it can impact things like addiction. Understanding my patterns and behaviors that are leading to problematic actions in my life. One thing I can do, yes, I can better understand myself, but part of that could be better understanding humans. And one perspective that I uh, hadn't really wasn't really well practiced at was then looking at humans as an animal, right? So taking the same sort of approach we have to studying other animal behavior and looking at humans through that lens. And one of the things that we know very well is that humans are extremely social organisms. And when I look at, when I was ready to walk off into the woods, and early on in recovery, when people are talking about fear, and I was still like I'm not afraid of nothing. We're gonna talk about fear,
Yeah.
um, and then finding it like, oh, fear of social rejection has is such a driving force for me that um, that I was it was such a driving force that I was unaware that it was a driving force. So I I have a buddy who used to always say that addicts aren't stupid, we're just dumb. And right.
I love
So
that. Yeah.
for me, like one of the problems we can actually have such a high emotional intelligence and be so good at socializing that we can use it against ourselves. So one of the traps that I had locked myself into was the group that I was drawn towards. Um, there was a sense of to fit into that group, the most appealing persona was I don't care what anybody thinks. I was adopting that persona because I cared what they thought, right?
Yeah.
So my my detachment from um, from social acceptance was actually a strategy to gain social acceptance, and
Ooh.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it took me a while to kind of to see through that, um, and I'm sure it still sneaks up on me from time to time. But once I started to kind of accept how much of a part of uh, my being is to to seek out other people, um, I got a little more comfortable with the drive that it is in my life. Um, there's this. So a lot of these studies based off of functional nuclear magnetic resonance imaging. So it's kind of a new field, and we can debate on how much it's really telling us, but we can now see in much greater resolution where is blood going in the brain. And
Yeah.
there's all sorts of fun little studies that have come about, but one of my favorites is that unexpected social rejection. Um, so the way that they set this up in the laboratory is you're in an MRI and you're playing catch, right? So you can't see, but you
Okay.
get into a ball thrown to you in a group of people. And
Right.
unbeknownst to you, part of the trial is that at one point they stop passing the ball to you. Right? So it's like there's this game of catch, pass it to whoever, and all of a sudden nobody's passing the ball to you. And what we see is that blood flow goes to the exact same location in the brain as uh, pain, physical pain. So like physical pain and sudden unexpected social rejection are actually activating the same place in the brain.
Huh.
Um, and it is that place in the brain that acetaminophen takes effect, Tylenol. Right? So what I tell my teenagers is if you're going to be in a high school romance, you should carry Tylenol in case you get heartbroken. The science will tell you that it actually will help a little bit with the initial heartbreak. So it's deeply wired in who we are,
Dude,
um,
that's wild. That is
right?
wild right there.
And
Wow.
I mean, there's so much evidence for it in a variety of ways. Um, us having this conversation, right? So again, based off of multiple lines of evidence, speech developed as a social adaptation, and I mean, that it makes sense. Like, why am I talking? It's not to communicate to another human, but when we compare it to auditory communication of other animals, what we see is a correlation to how sophisticated their communication is, correlated to how complex their social structures are.
Huh. Yeah.
Which I can tie back to what I had mentioned to you is one of the things that interests me, which is so when we talk about uh, drug policy, and you and I have talked before, and I know that we share similar opinions on some things. We may have uh, differences in opinion on how to get there, but I think that we have pretty similar vision of where we would like to see society and culture shift to, which
For sure.
which is, I think a big part of it is risk mitigation, right? So
Yes.
when I, as a adolescent, decided that it wasn't that risky, I was wrong because I didn't really understand drug addiction. And there were elements of it that had I known, maybe I would have assessed it differently. So with my family not using drugs, I felt like a black sheep, that this was something I decided to do, and I very much kept hidden from them. And so as it became more of a part of my life, they became less a part of my life. Uh, and then it was only after getting clean that I found out, oh, the broader story of my family, my nuclear family, are the black sheep. That drug addiction and other closely related mental health disorders, they have a long history in my family. And I
Mm.
don't think that would have tipped the scales for me, but that was information I didn't really have. It was looking at it as a mental health disorder that does have some uh, familial trend, and I'm in a family that suffers from it. Uh, so that statistically, I was more likely to struggle when I took that first drug out of. curiosity. Um, and so, I'm not to judge what other people are going to do with their lives, and my experience won't be other people's experience, and some people will have positive experiences with drugs, and I, um, on my good days, I don't hold that against them. On on my bad days,
Man, you're a better man than me because I don't want to say that I don't have those good days too, but I do
I didn't say they were
feel
often.
okay, fair. Like I that just brief pang of jealousy
100%.
that somebody else can dip their toe in that water, not have any negative effects, and not have that obsession just ruin their lives. Um,
I and well, and this is interesting because I don't think that this is uh, maybe not white held approach to it, but for me, while as uncomfortable as that jealousy is, I would rather have that than assuming they're headed towards ruin. Like
ooh,
the because the other perspective on it was, oh, it just hasn't gotten me yet. You
yeah,
know,
man.
I I had periods in my life where it wasn't that problematic, right? And
Yeah,
one of my first mentors, he talked about addiction a lot as a memory disease, where that's what I remember. This period of my life where the consequences hadn't built back up, and those are the memories that my brain recalls most often, and I want to trick myself into thinking that that's what I would return to. Um, when I no longer believe that's the case. I'll return to that torturous falling asleep at night and with a bag packed, standing on a railroad, planning to walk out into the wilderness.
right.
Um, but oh yeah, jealous 100%.
And
I
that is a good point. That and I would have to agree with that. I would much rather take the jealousy than the other side. And I'm gonna admit it, man. Like for a particularly before I even started this podcast, I had that thought. And my view on how the world recovers was vastly different than it is today. I was a very much so abstinent only type of person, and having had the conversation that I've had on this show has forced me to evolve and forced me to get to that place where it's simply just jealousy, and it's
right.
not like, waiting for the other shoe to drop for somebody. Cause that ain't right, dude. It's not cool not that I was wishing it on them, but I was like truly expecting that, for them. And that's not, dude, that's no way to look at the world, you
and
know?
and then also when I can step back and kind of recollect myself, it's also just not very evidence based.
No, it's
Um,
not.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but which is again that kind of self bias that I still have a hard time understanding the person who has a drink, enjoys it, and then stops. And I'm like, but but that means you would enjoy a second one, right? Like, so you,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so that mental process still doesn't quite make sense to me, and is where the divide starts to grow. But you know, in the recovery community, there can be very different opinions on it. I have run into, and I'm sure you as well, a much more, uh, I tend to think of them as kind of old school, uh, tough love uh, mentality towards what a person into recovery needs or what it takes to get into recovery. And and that's where I think that some of the ideas of risk mitigation can get tricky. Where it's like if you are softening the experiences of drug addiction, that maybe they won't hit bottom or realize a need for help. They won't experience desperation on the same level to the same extreme.
Right.
I don't agree with that approach
No.
um, because a lot of times for the person who experiences a high level of desperation and then gets clean, there are, for that one person, there are 100 other that die or go to a place that they're not coming back from.
Right.
And and so I do think that there is a a bit of a public responsibility to reduce um, the the consequences or the risks of the decision that somebody makes, and that becomes especially interesting for adolescents. So teenagers, it's a that's a tricky thing to define. What is adolescence? Because for a long time we just described it as hormonal changes, right? It's just a part of development. You know, in other animals, we tend to just go uh, young to adult. And what's the division? It's sexual maturity. And then in humans and other primates, it's a little trickier because there's this kind of this gray area where those changes take place over a longer period of time. And that's kind of what we called adolescence, was just puberty. And more so, what we've been realizing recently is that there's a societal component, right? There's how we treat uh, people in that time of life, and so that can be very different culturally. Uh, but again, going back to brain imaging, where a lot of those initial changes that we thought were hormonal, they are coinciding simultaneously with the brain maturing. Uh, and specifically, what we've been able to uh, pinpoint are what's called dendritic pruning, so or sorry, synaptic pruning, which is you actually have more connections in your brain at a younger age, but they might it's too many, right? It's inefficient. So we're getting
Right.
rid of some of the connections in our brain, and then myelination, so increasing the speed of signaling. And those two things happen. It's a range, but it's somewhere starting around 10 years of age and ending somewhere in the mid 20s. And so, with that change, that physical change of the brain's structure across the board, and so not just humans, in other animals, we see adolescence um, typified by risk seeking, uh, or risk taking, novelty seeking, and peer relationships. So I think it becomes a tricky period of time to look at something like risk mitigation because they are more likely to take risks. They're more likely to seek out new experiences.
Yeah.
So that sounds like trying drugs for the first time. And then you add to that this the heightened focus on peer relationships, as you know, psychologically we think that that has to do with kind of uh, developing independence outside of the family frame. Right? So you're finding out who you are outside of just your family. Um, but again, the thing that fascinates me is we've seen this in. There was this study that I find hilarious, which is uh, rats drinking alcohol, and so rats, adult rats and juvenile rats, will drink the same amount of alcohol by themselves. But if you put them in a group with their peers, with other juvenile rats, then juvenile rats will actually drink more alcohol.
Huh.
And yeah, and part of the
Huh.
thought that's going on there for the human adolescent is that so take a 13-year-old who has done has the information at hand and doesn't believe that smoking cigarettes is worth the risk. But you put them in a social situation where all of their peers are smoking cigarettes. And they've assessed that risk, but they have different priorities. And so the greater risk in that moment is social rejection. It's not that they haven't assessed risk at all, it's just that they've assessed it differently. And and for them at that time, being a part of their peer group is more important, and it changes the risk calculation. And then you add to that that statistically you are most likely to develop a mental illness during adolescence. That is when they most commonly come on. And then statistics on violence and on and on and on. It can be a very tricky uh, stage of life. And I know that's when I started experimenting with drugs. I got clean relatively young, so
Yeah.
most of my drug use was in adolescence. And one of the things that fascinates me now, thinking back to my experience with Dare and being dared to explore euphoria, um, is are we doing are we doing that properly? Like, are we collectively? What is our approach as a society towards getting drug information out to the the most susceptible uh, demographic? And and that's one of those questions where I think I can say that we're not doing the best we could, but I also
Mm-mm.
don't know uh, a first step towards improvement.
I think a huge first step would be to stop falsely villainizing certain substances, or at least putting them on the same pedestal as others. I know when I went through Dare, heroin and weed were on the same tier, according
Right.
to that Dare officer, right? And I very specifically remember smoking weed for my first time ever and thinking, man, they missed the mark on this one. And I just assumed that that was going to hold true for all of them.
Yeah.
Now, I will tell you that no, like some of them were pretty close to the mark. You know what I mean? But uh, I, at that point, all caution for trying new substances was out the window. All of it.
Mhm.
You know. Um, so I think a very personally a good first step would be honest education. You know.
Yeah, and well, that's interesting because just as you're saying that, I've a dot, two dots connected for me, which is yeah, honest education, which can be really tough to pull off because um, the there are a lot of individuals in my profession who might bring their own opinions to the
Right.
table. It can very easily demoralize, right? Let alone uh, feeling like you have to like I don't know uphold or preach legalities, right? And
Mm.
so yes, I don't feel like it's just information based. Um, that information is behind the screen of here's what's legal, and often here's what's right and wrong, and then after all of that, there might be some information. But it's interesting because I do think, um, earlier you mentioned the idea of having better dialogue, better communication about the nature of addiction. And I think that's a component as well because when you're
Mm.
being honest, I think the only thing that maybe is down there is this sense of a gateway drug. And that's a weird and kind of confusing approach separated away from addiction, right?
Yes.
Where um, a gateway drug makes more sense as a phenomenon that occurs in somebody who is an addict and doesn't know it yet. Um, but again, we don't have we don't currently have enough uh, public understanding to have that be a part of the risks that are communicated, right? So, because when I talk to students from time to time about marijuana, it 100% is less has less risk. Um, it has less risk than alcohol. right?
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, I do think then it's very easy for them to run to no risk. I'm like, well, that's not true either, right? Um,
Right.
because I know full blown addicts that it's marijuana. I mean, that's they can get to the same terrible places we do without having done anything else.
Yeah.
And then one of those that is it's a statistical oddity, right? When you talk about marijuana use, it is unlikely, but from my own experience, um, marijuana can trigger marijuana psychosis, or it can trigger uh, latent mental illnesses. I have I grew up with three potheads whose schizophrenia was triggered by smoking pot. And I
Wow.
know I know that's a statistical outlier. Like that, it's really bizarre that I would have uh, known and grown up with three of them. But from my own personal experience, I'm like, well, there's a risk, right? I mean,
Right.
I got buddies that they went off. It was a long road back to any semblance of normalcy for them, um, from smoking a joint and then like, I mean, I like clinically losing it to the point where like we're freaked out and like calling the ambulance or the cops on your buddy because it's like this is something different.
Yeah, dude,
Um,
that's a whole ordeal then at that point, you
mm-hmm,
know? Whoa. I'll tell you, since Oklahoma, um, since we got medical,
mm-hmm,
and I've been in outpatient treatment programs, I've been in meetings, I've been in multiple recovery type environments. And since we've got that medical, there is people that show up specifically for um, marijuana, the marijuana addiction. And, I think that it's like you said, we still don't know enough about this stuff. And we don't. We're kind of getting a real time look at, how this affects the whole population.
yeah,
And I think the best thing that we could possibly do is as that information comes out, make it readily available.
yeah. Well,
And you being a scientist, I am curious, like, what does it make you feel when you hear the phrase "the science is settled"? How do you feel about that?
so um, it's interesting. I today I would consider myself a teacher. I have a hard time. You know, one of the other interesting like social artifacts from running with the subculture that I did and the age I did, and I'm willing to bet that you had a similar teenage experience. But um, the like the worst thing you could be in the world was a poser. You know, that was
Yeah.
like that was
Yeah.
that was the ultimate insult, and it's like, oh, just
Oh.
avoid that at all costs. You can't be a poser, and there's a little bit of that in me still, where I'm like, um, I, I think I understand science better than most, well enough to teach it. I haven't done it in a while, and I can't call myself a scientist. It's my personal take on it is like any other institution or approach to thinking. It is imperfect, but where it's different is it really tries, right? It really tries to be objective and so without getting lost in the jargon, this idea of likelihood of recurrence, right? That's what we build on. Is something that is likely to recur every time we
Yeah.
do it. This is always the outcome, and so that we can say that this isn't my view or your view. This is what will likely reoccur, and so you get into empiricism and experimentation. But just like the recovery community has a communication problem with the broader community, the sciences absolutely does as well. And when you talk to and interact with like really like in the trenches scientists, there is they are some of the most uh, skeptical and questioning individuals where nothing, like almost nothing is settled to the point where it's like, okay, ease up a little bit, like
Right.
they are ready for everything to be turned over and like, oh, we were wrong about everything.
Yeah.
Um, it's a fluid field of constantly of changing ideas, and one of the hopes is that through education, some of that can get across to students. Because I will say one of the challenges for me for switching to uh, public school and a younger age group was um, that the students don't choose my class. They do for zoology, but in my biology classes, every high school student has to take that class. And at first, I was like, I don't want to do that. I've gone a full 360 on that. No, full 180 on that, where I'm like, Mike, you want to do that because scientific thinking, um, done improperly, is it's somewhat weaponized, right? It's thrown at the populace as um, this is how you have to think about that because it's what science says. And um, man, science. It takes normally a couple of decades before we feel confident, any level of confidence in what the evidence is saying. And a lot of that can then be turned over. But uh, flashy headlines get out to the general population long before the scientific community has reached any sort of consensus. Um, and then, unfortunately, some things that there is general consensus on um, can be rejected if they challenge a core belief, a sacred belief for individuals. So it's another one where it's tricky. There's a phenomenon in relating to the uh, general public called the Sagan effect, Carl Sagan, where scientists they career wise they have to walk this unfortunately tricky tightrope where Carl Sagan was a very well respected scientist in his field. He did the work. He was a scientist, and then he started writing and becoming a science communicator. And um, sometimes to get points across, he might venture into a field that he's not an expert on. He might water something down for ease of explanation, and he drew a lot of uh, kind of back backlash from the scientific community of being slightly unscientific. And so
Mm.
they call it the Sagan effect because um, for to be in the scientific community, you want to be extremely rigorous, but that creates an inability to communicate with the uninitiated, right? But if
Mm.
you work on being better at communicating with the lay public, then you might get ostracized by the rigorously scientific community. Um, and that's another just unfortunate component um, to kind of have these conversations um, that are a little bit more informed, um, or at least have that perspective, have that scientific perspective as part of the dialogue.
Like, I wonder if we couldn't, find some way to bring forward that information and just have that, you know, unspoken understanding somehow to say like, look, we're still learning about this stuff, but here's where we're at currently. Not too much unlike what they did COVID. Granted, the politics they got involved with that, is crazy. But if there's some way that you could like get the actual raw information out there and just say, look, this is an ever evolving field, but currently what we're seeing, these are the trends. Um, Surely that would
Yeah,
be a damn sight better than the bro science that we see. you know, I mean, I remember the first time I did heroin, the guy who gave me heroin said, "Hey man, as long as you don't do this shit for more than 3 days in a row, you won't get dope sick." And that was gospel. You know what I mean? That was gospel to me at that point.
Yeah,
Obviously not true at all in the slightest, but that's the best I'd heard, because like I said, everything that I'd heard came from like politicians or the talking head on TV talking, just, vilifying this stuff. And I don't know, man. I'm just kind of like we talked about, just kind of like working through things by discussing it out loud. Um,
absolutely. Well, and one of the things too that so here where some scientists, some scientific thinkers might disagree with me, but what I hope to get across my students, and know that I often don't because they've got a lot of other things going on in their life, is
right.
um, they don't need to know the parts of a cell, right? I teach it to them, they get tested over it, but that's not what they need to know. They need to have the ability to evaluate a claim that somebody lays at their feet, right?
Ooh,
To be able to say, um, that's a conclusion you're drawing based off of some data. Could I see the data? And maybe I disagree with the conclusion. How strong is the data? How many studies have been done? What was the sample sizes? Um, what type of evidence is it? That's what I would like to see my students leave high school with. Is it ability to kind of challenge without becoming aggressive, much what we've been talking about. Have a good conversation without uh, automatically being at arms, right? Um, and also to maybe not be so offended when somebody challenges your line of thinking and asks to see your data or your evidence.
right.
But the other thing I tell them too is that um, science has it's a part of my recovery, right? It's it, for me, recovery is in part about kind of getting this view of the world that works for me, where I can spend most of my time content or even happy, and I can give to others, and um, and that worldview, like science, changes and shifts with time, but also that science doesn't stand by itself, right? It's one piece of my worldview. It's a larger percentage than many other people, but it's not the only way in which I process the world. And when you really want to talk about kind of being, for me, another big part of becoming comfortable talking with people that have a different perspective than my own is that I might hold views that are contradictory, right? Like, and giving myself the freedom for that to have beliefs that don't entirely make sense, but hold to them. I think that's a part of recovery because if I was just going off of evidence and statistics, then it would have been really difficult to be hopeful in early recovery
Right.
because my own experience was I'm going to keep using drugs even when I think I'm going to stop. And the statistics say most people who have addiction continue using drugs. And and so I couldn't have a completely analytical scientific approach to that. But I do like it to be a part of my worldview. And so you brought this up. I'll take this as a segue into an example where science, I don't know if it means anything to anybody else, but it makes my life just a little bit richer. And I had a tendency, I have a tendency to overthink and overcomplicate things. And it had to be pointed out to me in early recovery that the most important thing first is like, let's get clean. Let's do that.
Right.
Figure out how to do that. And then a little later on down the road, if you want to wax philosophically, go for it. Right. In that regards, for me personally, science tells us a lot of really interesting things. But it's not going to change the reality of experiencing addiction. And um, I don't think it's drastically going to change how some people will have to approach recovery. Um, there might be more options, but I think some people are going to have to choose a solution very similar to what you and I have done. And
Mm.
so one of the things that I got into this, it had been gnawing at the back of my head, and the first kind of like turning point um, was this. Went to a meeting, go out to eat afterwards, to fellowship as you should, and uh, it was one of those times of being of valuing and surround yourself, if at all possible, by people. Maybe it's self-deprecating to say people that are smarter than you, but that have different strengths, different expertise. So I got into this argument about whether or not you could have take a selfless act, whether you could have a selfless motivation. And I'm arguing it with a lawyer, like she was, you know, Ivy League uh, debate team, right? And um, and we're having this argument, and for her, it's kind of like she's going to win all of the semantic points. But I'm like struggling with something because um, she is saying, which my own logic had said before, that it wasn't possible. It wasn't possible to do anything that was selfless, right? That because even if I do something selfless and it makes me feel good, well then maybe that was my selfish motivation, right? So that's where the argument started, and where I was like, ooh, was we ran into this at the end of it. I was challenging it with the notion of in nature a a mother protecting her offspring. Right?
Mm.
How is that uh, selfless? Or how is that selfish? How is it not a selfless act? If if an animal ends up dying uh, in defense of its offspring, that seems pretty selfless. And her rebuttal was that for the mother, her offspring were an extension of herself. And I was like, ooh. So
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe one thing is one way of looking at it is you can't have a selfless act, but how do you define yourself? Right? What does your identity incorporate? If it can incorporate your family, can you extend it beyond that? Um, and in the sciences, there's some interesting work with that. There's we're not as well defined as we like to think, but we're a part of a society, we're a part of an ecosystem, we're made up of uh, trillions of individual functioning components, so on and so forth. But the other place that science stepped in that I found fascinating was this that notion of kind of not just looking out for your own interests as a what would be favored by evolution through natural selection, but kin selection, that you would do whatever is best for your family. That would be favored by evolution through natural selection. Uh, so kin selection was this hypothesis that was thrown about for a little bit. And one of the most interesting offshoots from kin selection comes from a science hero of mine who died earlier this year or last year, a man named E.O. Wilson. And what I've always found fascinating about E.O. Wilson is that later in his career, he's made a lot of very profound observations and speculations about human behavior that have had like a deep impact in my life. And he got there by studying ants. Like the first part of his life, he is the ant expert. Um, and the thing is, an ant colony is extremely social in a very different way than we are, but very, very social. Individual ants, stupid. Collectively, they're a pretty miraculous organism, including things like uh, they, they have architecture, they have farming, and ranching. They go to war. They take prisoners. They have burial mounds. All of those things exist within ant colonies.
Huh.
And so, how does this simple thing, if we better understand how they socialize, maybe um, we can take something from that and apply it to humans. And so, the offshoot that he was interested in kin selection is this idea of in group, out group selection. Right? So, within a group, the idea is the doing what is best for number one will help you rise in the ranks of your group. Right? Everybody's looking out for themselves, competing, doing whatever is the best for themselves, because it's how you move up within your group. But out group selection would actually favor altruism, because the idea there is that when two separate groups come into conflict, one that is made up of altruistic individuals that are uh, less interested in their own uh, survival well-being or benefits as opposed to the groups, that group will work more successfully together. So um, the analogy kind of thinks is if you had a platoon of soldiers and you have one where every single soldier in the group is just trying to survive versus a platoon of soldiers where they are all trying to make sure that their group survives. That group is going to win the battle. Um, so being a individual that is both within groups and those groups could conflict with other groups, I have these two poles. One that is look out for self and move up, and another that says look out for everyone around you so that you are a stronger cohesive. Um,
Mm.
and I haven't finished digesting what that means for me, but it means something.
Yeah.
I know that that it helped me kind of get a sense of um, being selfless isn't just a trick I'm pulling on myself, right? It's
Yeah.
not just something that I do so that I get the dopamine rush for feeling like a good person. Um, there's another perspective on it which says, no, it's something deeply ingrained in what it means to be human, is that to succeed as a member of a group, the group that I'm in needs to also be strong, and that requires selflessness. And if I look at that in context of recovery, there's this sense of you've got to take care of your own recovery, right? Um,
Mm.
but at the same time, my recovery relies heavily on 12 step groups. So I also need that group to survive. And so I want to balance those two things. I want to balance what is the best for my personal recovery, what is the best thing for the recovery community.
Yeah, dude. So like that's a really, really good point, you know. Um, especially in the rooms of 12 steps, like that is one of the traditions. Personal recovery depends on 12 step unity. That's part of it. Um, and I can see that in my life as well. Like how well I'm doing as an individual, as a person in my own personal journey of recovery is heavily reliant upon how well I'm helping other people do the same. Um, and I'm not saying that like, every person in recovery obviously has to follow on that line, but certainly for me, it's very true. So that altruism is actually it's outward, but just as much as it outward is outward, it's also inward. But I mean, when you look at your fellow man as an extension of yourself, yeah, dude, this is radical. And I'm going down this rabbit hole now. Like you've
No,
got me on this thing.
I've been in that rabbit hole because again, it's one of those where so part of the logic there is like, okay, so I'm saying that altruism and recovery is important to me because it helps the recovery community, which then helps me, which goes back to that first argument of there's no such thing as a selfless motivation. But
Right.
what I what I get from being interested in the world around me and from ants is that sense of okay, but it actually only works if it's selfless, right? So
Mm.
so I don't get the personal benefit if it was a selfish act. Right? Uh,
Yeah.
you could argue that my selfless acts will benefit me individually, but outgroup selection is arguing that um, the group does rely on a selfless act. Um, so it does have to be for the group before it can turn around and benefit me as an individual.
Mm. You brought the stinky cheese, man, with you. This is the good stuff. I like this, man. I'm gonna rub on this one for a while. This isn't something that gets solved today. Like this is something I'm gonna walk away
100%.
with.
And for me, one of the things that um, a a life without drugs has afforded me is uh, to sit with an idea and be able to come back to it. You know, like my brain was all over the place. I would think in circles. My thoughts wouldn't actually lead to anything. And I think about something like you doing this podcast, where I remember one of the things that I felt like I was losing was uh, my own creativity and membership in this uh, subculture of very creative individuals.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
um, my a good friend of mine early on in recovery, very uh, creative individual. He's a writer and a literature professor, and his point was, if you look at the word creative, a lot of drug addicts feel creative, but they don't actually create much, right? They don't actually have the ability to follow through and make things that might be imperfect and put them out in the world and deal with their insecurities. Uh, are there addicts who can do that? Absolutely. But there are a lot of us who just felt creative, but didn't actually have the self discipline to turn around and create. And
Mm.
I have a hard time thinking that you would have been able to pull off a podcast in
Oh
that
hell no.
position,
Hell
right?
no. Hell no. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, man, that's good stuff. Let me one last question before we
absolutely.
start wrapping this
Oh,
up.
I'm ready for it. I know the question, and I'm still not ready for it.
Well,
Dang.
not
Okay,
that
what is it?
not that one yet.
Oh, okay. One
But
before
this
that
is
one. Okay.
yeah, one before that one. This is just one. So the prevailing school of thought in professional mental health and substance abuse services at present is that the opposite of addiction is connection. What
Hmm.
do you do? How valid do you think that is?
Opposite of addiction is connection. It doesn't ring true. My,
Right?
I might have to sit with that for a little while just because of, um, but I can tell you my gut reaction, which is um, there were times in addiction where I felt very connected.
Yes.
Um, I felt
Yes.
connected at the dope house. That was part of what pulled me further into it.
Yes.
Now, did that did those groups always fall apart because um, the individuals need to get high eventually trumped all? Yeah, sure, but uh, but connection was a part of it. And then I also think about codependence, um, which many addicts struggle with codependence, and codependence is like being overly connected or unhealthfully connected. So um, I it feels like a desire to simplify something that may be too complicated to simplify. I could it would have felt better to me if you said something like the opposite of addiction is healthy connections, maybe.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I don't. It didn't. Uh, it didn't feel like a. Oh, that's well said.
Right,
That's not
right.
how
It
it struck
sounds
me.
it's one of those things that sounds slick, but for
Hmm.
those of us who speak that hip, slick, and cool language, it just it sounds false. At least,
Oh, and I gotta tell you,
once I wrote it was kind of I came to the same conclusion that you did is a positive connection, maybe.
yeah,
Maybe a positive but I can tell you right now, um, I have narcotics to thank for my ability to be social because I did not have that. I was very painfully shy and just did not know how to communicate with other people. It was in dealing with those different counterculture groups and having to in order to obviously maintain my addiction that I developed that connection, and through that connection developed a social skill set you know um so yeah, I wanted to hear your take on it though, at
yeah, and I
least.
will say I was once very interested in opposites, and so now I'm like, okay, if I don't agree with that, what would I say is the opposite of addiction? And okay, nothing is coming to me because I wouldn't say that recovery is the opposite of addiction.
Mm-mm.
There's too much overlap there. Um,
I
so
would say
yeah,
moderation. That's the closest I've come up to with it, is moderation is the opposite of addiction.
hmm. Well, now you gave me some sneaky cheese to sit
Mm.
with.
And it's not perfect by any means, but I feel like it's closer than the connection line.
Yeah,
Like the opposite of addiction is connection feels like live, laugh, love type language that you put up on the wall of a, multi-million dollar treatment center, right?
right.
Like that's what that feels like to me.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
it's one of those where it's rooted in enough truth that I get how some people cling to it because
for
it is
sure.
definitely it can definitely be a part of escaping active addiction, right?
Right. Right.
Um, but but if you're talking full on opposite, yeah, I'm not there.
Not there either. All right, man. Well, Ben, let's get to the question that you may or may not be
Mhm.
prepared for. And
That
that
I knew was
is
coming and
that
wasn't
you knew
prepared
were
for.
coming.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want you to take a second to address that person in the audience who may or may not be listening who is struggling to find a way out of addiction, particularly that hyper intelligent addict who
Mm.
is out there who is struggling with, finding that way into recovery.
All right. Um, so surrender was something that took me a while to understand on a personal level. And for the hyperintelligent, I think one of the issues was I had thought about my life dilemma from every perspective I could, and I didn't see any answers, which then meant it was pointless to ask for help. Right? If no help was available, why ask?
Hmm.
And what I'm saying is that asking can bring relief, even if help doesn't follow. Often you'll be
Hmm.
surprised that there's help available you were unaware of. But even if you're right and there is no help available for you, asking brings relief. Um, so if you have any inkling that you might need help, um, but just don't really believe it will actually come to fruition, ask anyways. Because what's the harm? Um, you feel foolish. Um, so what? Just take that. Uh, ask somebody for help. Um, and then, I, on a practical level, so much of early recovery, and getting clean, is feels mysterious to me. Right? I have
Yeah.
the I have a better grasp on staying clean, um, getting clean. I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't really know. The only bit of practical wisdom that I cling to um, is that whole idea of um, break it down to 5 minutes, right? Use use procrastination to your advantage, and just tell yourself, I'm just going to wait 5 minutes,
Mm.
and then at the end of that 5 minutes, try to wait five more, um, and do that as much as you can, knowing that it will shift if you put in enough time. The landscape does shift, and that 5 minute plan uh, is not a lifelong commitment.
Mm. Man, that's good stuff, brother. That's good stuff. I sure do love you, Ben, for
Because
real.
I got you.
Um, you'd mentioned it before, and because it's a common phrase that I like to talk about, but iron sharpens iron. It's because of individuals like you in my personal life that I'm able to continue down this road. Particularly individuals like you who like to entertain some of those batshit crazy ideas that we get in our head. Um, that's important to have like-minded individuals in my life. And I'm just really grateful that you'd take the time to not only hang out with a chucklehead like me, but also come on his podcast and share your own story.
Oh man, I loved it. I'm flattered to be invited on, and I will leave feeling sharper as well.
Right on, man. Well, anytime you want to come back on, buddy, you just give me a ring.
Will do.
All right, brother. Have a good night.
You the same.
All right, there you go, Ben. Thank you so much, brother, for coming on. Thank you guys for listening. And there's a lot of information that's there. If you do not have friendships, that bring value to you in the way that like Ben and others in my life bring value to me, like guys, go out and find that. Like that is such an important part of the human experience. As Ben kind of pointed out, and we both discussed, is that humans are very social creatures. That is a biological thing within us that we need and crave. And so, yeah. Anyways, thank you guys for tuning in. And I hope that wherever you're at, you're having a fun and safe 4th of July. Enjoy this weekend, man. Go out there and find that freedom in your life that you have. Find that liberty. Hold on to it and appreciate it. And most of all, just be safe. And I'm going to bring you guys into the song of the day. This is a really fun, kind of like old folksy type of, I don't even know how you describe this genre, but I really enjoy it. This guy's name is Nick Shoulders, and the song's called Snakes and Waterfalls. And I don't know, man, I really dig it a lot. I hope that you guys do too. Like I said, have fun, be safe out there, and we will see you guys next week. Big love.